Rain had been hammering the Manitoba flatlands for 3 days straight when the stranger pulled Fern Calloway out of the ditch. She hadn't been unconscious long. Maybe 20 minutes. Maybe an hour. The kind of time that disappears when your truck has rolled twice down an embankment and the creek at the bottom is swallowing your legs up to the knee. The October cold in that part of the province didn't negotiate. It simply began the process of shutting a body down, organ by organ, with the quiet efficiency of something that had been doing it for 10,000 years. Fern knew she was in trouble when she stopped shivering. That's what her grandfather had told her once, sitting by the wood stove in his farmhouse outside of Portage-la-Prairie. He'd said it the way old men say things that matter without any drama. When you stop shivering, girl, that's when you're already losing the argument with the cold. She had stopped shivering. The hands that pulled her up the muddy slope were not gentle, but they were sure. There was no hesitation in them, no tentative testing of her weight. Whoever it was simply gripped her under both arms and hauled her upward through the wet grass and the clay mud, as though she were a calf that had gotten itself tangled in a fence line. She was aware of rain on her face. She was aware of the grinding ache in her left shoulder, where she'd hit the door panel. And then she was aware of warmth, which was the most alarming sensation of all, because warmth, when you've been that cold, feels like hallucination. She came back to herself on a cot in a room that smelled of motor oil, cedar, and something faintly medicinal. A wood-burning stove in the corner was working hard. The single window above a cluttered workbench showed nothing but dark and rain. She was wrapped in something heavy and wool, and her boots had been removed. A man sat at the workbench with his back to her, his shoulders a broad, angular shape in the lamplight. He was doing something with his hands, though she couldn't see what. He hadn't heard her wake, or if he had, he wasn't in any hurry to acknowledge it. Fern tried to sit up and made a sound she hadn't intended to make. He turned then. He was somewhere in his late 40s, maybe 50, with a face that looked like it had been left out in the weather on purpose. Deep lines around the eyes, a jaw that could have been cut from the limestone shelf country up near Riding Mountain. His hair was dark going silver at the temples. He wasn't tall in the way that announces itself, but he was built like someone who had been doing physical work his entire life without ever thinking much about it. Easy, he said. One word. Flat as the prairie outside. Where am I? Fern asked. My property. About 6 kilometers off Highway 16. Your truck is in the creek. You had your hazards going, or I'd have driven past. He stood up and moved to the stove, lifting a battered enamel pot and pouring something into a mug. He brought it over and held it out. His eyes didn't leave her face, but they weren't unkind. They were the eyes of someone who had learned to assess situations before reacting to them. Drink it, it's just broth. Fern took the mug with both hands. The warmth moved through her palms and up her arms like something being restored. She drank. I need to call someone, she said. Phone lines are down from the storm. Cell signal out here is never reliable. He nodded toward the workbench. I've got a satellite radio. We can try to reach someone in the morning when the weather lifts. Morning. The word landed differently than it should have. Fern set the mug carefully on the edge of the cot. She became aware, suddenly and with a cold clarity that had nothing to do with the temperature outside, of what she was wearing. Or rather, what she wasn't wearing anymore. Her jacket was gone, her flannel shirt. She was in a thermal undershirt, and her jeans, both still slightly damp. The heavy wool blanket had hidden what wasn't there. She reached up instinctively, her right hand pressing flat against her chest. It was still there. She felt the rigid shape of it through the thin thermal fabric, the flat rectangular edge of it pressed against her sternum, and she felt the specific, familiar knot of the cord that held it there. Relief hit her so hard her vision swam, but the man had noticed the gesture. She could tell without looking at him directly. He was too still in the way that people get still when they've registered something and are deciding what to do with it. Your jacket was soaked through, he said quietly. I had to get it off you. Your core temperature was dangerously low. I didn't touch anything else. Fern looked at him then. She searched his face for something she didn't want to find there, and didn't find it. Thank you, she said carefully. He gave a short nod and returned to the workbench. She watched the back of his shoulders and tried to breathe steadily. The thing against her chest was a manila envelope, sealed with waterproof tape and then again with a cord looped 3 times around her torso beneath her clothing. She'd worn it that way for 11 days. She'd slept with it, bathed around it, kept it pressed against her skin every hour of every day since she'd taken it from the safety deposit box in Winnipeg and understood what was inside. She hadn't told anyone she had it. Not her sister, not her mother. Not the 2 people who had come to her apartment 7 days ago, knocking with a kind of patience that was somehow worse than urgency, asking very politely if she had found anything among her father's belongings that seemed out of the ordinary. Her father, Gord Calloway, had died 6 weeks ago. A heart attack, they said, in the parking garage of his office building in downtown Winnipeg. His company keys were still in his hand. His phone had been wiped before anyone found him, though that detail had never made it into the obituary. Fern was 24 years old, and she was the only person alive who knew that her father, a provincial agricultural inspector for 22 years, had spent the last 3 of those years documenting something that certain people very much did not want documented. The rain intensified against the window. The stove ticked and breathed. "What's your name?" the man at the workbench asked without turning around. "Fern." A pause. "Ridley," he said, "just the one name." She didn't ask for the other. She lay back down and stared at the low ceiling and listened to the rain, and tried to figure out how terrified she should actually be. By the time gray light crept under the door the next morning, Fern had slept for 4 hours and woken with her heart slamming against the envelope like it was trying to get out. She lay still for a full minute, listening. The stove had been stoked, she could hear it, which meant Ridley had been up before her, which meant he had moved around the space without waking her, which meant either he was not a threat or he was very practiced at not appearing to be one. She got up slowly. Her shoulder had stiffened overnight into a hot, grinding ache, but her feet were hers again, and her hands had stopped the wooden numbness of the night before. Ridley was outside. She could see him through the small window above the workbench, splitting wood in the pale morning with mechanical efficiency, his breath pluming in the cold air. He had the look of a man who had been doing the same tasks in the same order for years, and found a kind of structure in that. There was coffee on the stove. She poured herself a mug and looked around the room properly for the first time. It was a workshop attached to what appeared to be a larger house, or the remnants of one. Tools hung on pegboard with the obsessive neatness of someone who had once lost something important by not putting it back in its place. There were mechanical parts she couldn't identify, lengths of chain, a half-rebuilt engine block on a reinforced table in the corner. No photographs anywhere, no decorative objects of any kind. On the shelf above the workbench, a row of thick binders, each one labeled in the same neat block handwriting. Agricultural records, she realized. Land surveys, soil remediation reports, the kind of documentation that looked exactly like her father's work. She moved closer without thinking about it. The binders were labeled by year. The most recent one said 2019. The name on the spine wasn't Ridley. It was Ridley Fawcett, and beneath the name a title she recognized immediately because she had seen it on her father's business cards. Manitoba Provincial Agricultural Inspector, Region 4. The mug nearly left her hand. She set it down carefully on the workbench and stood very still, looking at the binders, and the thing strapped to her chest felt suddenly heavier than it had since she'd left Winnipeg. The door opened behind her. Cold air and the smell of split wood came in with Ridley. He saw where she was standing. He saw the look on her face. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "You knew my father," Fern said. It wasn't a question. The way she said it was the way you say something when you already know the answer but need to hear it out loud to make it real. Ridley put the axe down against the wall. He took his coat off and hung it on the hook by the door. He was very deliberate about these small actions, and she understood instinctively that this was what he did when he needed to think. "Gord Calloway," he said finally. Fern's throat tightened. "He was my supervisor," Ridley said, "for about 8 years. Before he moved up to the regional office in the city." He looked at her steadily. He talked about his daughters. The oldest one went into nursing. The younger one was doing her environmental science degree and giving him fits about it because she kept getting into arguments with her professors. The detail was so specific and so entirely correct that Fern had to look away. "He's gone," she said. "I know." Something moved behind Ridley's eyes. Above. A controlled grief. The kind that has been living in a person long enough to be managed, but not the kind that ever actually leaves. "I heard in August. I left the department 4 years ago. I heard through people I still know. Why did you leave?" The question was too direct. She knew it as she asked it. But she was 24 years old, and she had been carrying this envelope for 11 days, and she was very, very tired of not knowing who she could trust. Ridley looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled a chair out from beneath the workbench and sat down, and he told her. He had been a provincial inspector for Region 4 for 11 years. In 2018, during a routine soil contamination survey near the Assiniboine River corridor, he had found something that shouldn't have been there. Pesticide compound levels in the groundwater that exceeded federal limits by a factor of 8. A single source, traceable to an industrial-scale operation that, on paper, was registered as a mid-size grain farm. The operation was owned by a numbered company. The numbered company resolved, after a great deal of digging, to a man named Harlan Voss. Fern went completely still. Harlan Voss was the name in the envelope. "I submitted the report," Ridley said. "Properly, through every correct channel. Within 2 weeks I was called into the regional office and told my findings had been reviewed and found to be the result of a calibration error in my testing equipment. The report was pulled. I was offered a transfer to a northern posting." He paused. "I declined the transfer. They found other reasons to let me go." He looked at his hands, then back at her. "Your father called me 3 months before he died," Ridley said. "He said he'd found the original survey data, that he'd been tracking the contamination expansion for 2 years and had corroborating documentation from 4 other sites. He said he was putting it somewhere safe." The envelope against Fern's chest seemed to pulse with her heartbeat. "He never called back," Ridley said quietly. "And then I heard what happened in August." The wind moved across the roof of the workshop. Outside, the Manitoba sky was doing what it did in October, cycling through gray and grayer, and then a brief, brutal break of pale light before the clouds closed back over. Fern reached up. She pulled the collar of her thermal shirt aside and then lifted the fabric at the hem, showing him the cord, the loops around her torso, the flat edge of the envelope visible beneath it all. Ridley's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did, a recognition so deep it looked like pain. "He sent me the location of the safety deposit box," Fern said. "In a letter that came 2 days after he died. It looked like junk mail. My sister almost threw it out." She let the fabric fall back. "I've had it for 11 days. I didn't know who to trust. I didn't know if the people at the department were involved. I didn't know how high it went." "How high does it go?" Fern steadied herself. "There are signatures in those documents," she said. "Olerization signatures on reports that were altered and refiled." From the deputy minister's office, Ridley stood up slowly. He walked to the window and looked out at the flat, wet fields, and Fern watched his back and tried to read the set of his shoulders, the way she had learned to read her father's when he was working through something he couldn't yet speak aloud. "There are people looking for me," she said. "They came to my apartment. They said they were from the department, doing a routine follow-up on my father's estate. But one of them had been outside my building for 3 days before they knocked. I saw him from the window." Ridley turned around. "Where were you going?" he asked. "When you went off the highway." "Thompson. There's a journalist there. An investigative reporter who did a series on pesticide regulation for a national paper 2 years ago. I'd found her through my father's notes. He had her contact information flagged." Ridley was quiet for a moment. "A day's enqueu," he said. Fern blinked. "You know her?" "She called me 14 months ago. I didn't talk to her. I'd convinced myself it was over, that there was nothing left to do." He looked at Fern steadily. "Your father apparently didn't come to the same conclusion." The morning stretched between them. The stove made its small sounds. Somewhere out beyond the workshop wall, a crow called once, and then was silent. "The satellite radio," Fern said finally. "Can we reach her through that?" "It would take a relay through a station in Thompson." There's a communication frequency that independent operators use up here. Farmers, trappers. I know the station manager. Is he trustworthy? She, Ridley said, and she's the most trustworthy person I've ever met. Which in my experience usually means she's also the most stubborn. Something in his voice softened fractionally when he said it, and Fern filed that detail away. She stood up, and her shoulder screamed at her, and she ignored it. Then let's try. The satellite radio was in the main house, a low, sprawling farmhouse that looked like it had been added to over several decades by people with different ideas about architecture and no particular budget. Ridley's kitchen was clean in the way of someone who lives alone and has reduced their life to its necessary functions. One coffee cup, one bowl drying on the rack, a single wooden chair pulled up to a table that was large enough for 6 people, but held only a radio, a notebook, and a pencil. He found the frequency with the ease of long habit. Static poured through the room, and then a woman's voice cut through it, sharp and clear as a blade through cold air. Go ahead, Ridley, I hear you fine. What's got you on the line at this hour, you unsociable man? Despite everything, Fern almost smiled. The woman's name was Bet Chamberlain. She was, as it turned out, a retired nurse who had taken over her late husband's communications relay station outside of Thompson, and decided she liked it better than retirement. She knew Adieze Nkuwu. She knew her well enough to have her direct number, and to know that she was not, in fact, in Thompson at the moment. She was in Winnipeg. She had driven there 4 days ago, Bet said, because she'd gotten a tip about a story. Fern and Ridley looked at each other across the kitchen table. A tip about what kind of story? Ridley asked into the radio. Something to do with the agriculture department, Bet said, her voice carrying its particular combination of warmth and precision. She didn't give me details. She knows better than to use unsecured channels for that kind of thing. A pause. She did say she was looking for someone, though. A young woman. Said the young woman was the key to the whole thing, and she was worried something had happened to her. Fern pressed her hand flat against her chest without thinking, over the envelope, over her father's 3 years of careful documentations, over the thing that had gotten him killed and driven Ridley out of his career, and set Adieze Nkuwu driving through a Manitoba storm looking for a 24-year-old woman she'd never met. Can you get a message to her? Fern asked. A pause from the other end. Who am I talking to? Ridley said. Her name is Fern Calloway. She's Gord's daughter. The silence from the relay station lasted long enough that Fern thought they'd lost the signal, and then Bet Chamberlain said very quietly, Oh, sweetheart, she has been worried sick about you. Give me 20 minutes. Those 20 minutes were the strangest Fern could remember since her father's funeral. She sat at Ridley's kitchen table, and he made more coffee without asking if she wanted any, and they didn't speak very much. But the silence was different from the silence of the night before. It had less fear in it. She looked at the notebook on the table. The top page had a date from 3 weeks ago and a series of soil readings, coordinates, field notations, the same kind of work. Still, 4 years after they'd driven him out. You kept documenting, she said. He glanced at the notebook. Something moved through his face that she couldn't quite name. I kept thinking someone would eventually come to the same conclusion your father came to, he said. That the data doesn't lie, it just gets buried. And buried things have a way of surfacing. He said it the way her grandfather used to talk about frost heave on the back roads. The way people in this part of the country talked about the land itself, with a kind of flat, patient recognition that it had its own timelines and its own logic, and eventually made itself known regardless of what anyone wanted. The radio crackled. Bet's voice came through. She's on her way to you, Bet said. She says don't open the door to anyone else. She says she's bringing a constitutional lawyer from the University of Manitoba who has been waiting for exactly this situation for approximately 3 years. She says. A brief pause, and then Bet's voice carried a warmth that Fern could feel even through the static. She says to tell Gord's daughter that her father was the bravest civil servant she ever tried to interview, and the most stubborn. Fern's eyes went hot and bright. She didn't let herself look away from the radio. Tell her, Fern managed. That sounds about right. What happened next didn't happen quickly, because nothing that matters in this country ever does. The lawyer, a sharp-minded woman named Professor Osei, who had been building a case around regulatory corruption in provincial agriculture departments for the better part of a decade, went through the contents of the envelope with the deliberate patience of someone who has learned that haste is the enemy of prosecution. It took 4 hours. Outside, the October light died early and the temperature fell hard, and Ridley kept the wood stove fed and made soup from a pot on the back of the stove, without any ceremony about it. A day's inquiry was not what Fern had imagined. She was quieter. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak, every word had been weighed first. She had a small voice recorder that she placed on the table without asking permission and without apology. She had been trying to get this story for 2 years, she said. She had two other sources, both still inside the department, both terrified. The documentation in Fern's envelope was the piece that made everything else prosecutable. Harlan Voss was arrested by the RCMP 41 days later. The deputy minister resigned before charges were formally laid, citing health reasons, which convinced no one. 3 other department officials were suspended pending investigation. It took another 8 months before any of it made the national news in the way it deserved to, and by then Fern had deferred her final semester of her degree to give testimony and had moved temporarily to Thompson, staying in a spare room in Bet Chamberlain's house, which turned out to be the warmest place she'd been in years. Ridley's documentation, 4 years of unofficial contamination surveys conducted on his own time and his own equipment, was entered into the provincial record. Fern drove out to his property in February to tell him in person, because she felt that some things should not be delivered by phone. The cold that day had a teeth in it that even lifelong Manitobans mentioned to each other, the kind of -30 air that makes the snow squeak under your boots and turns your exhaled breath to ice before it disperses. She pulled up the long gravel drive, and he came out of the workshop when he heard the truck, and she told him standing in the yard with the cold pressing down from a sky the color of iron. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Your father would have been relieved." "I think he would have been furious that it took this long," Fern said. Something crossed Ridley's face that might, on someone else, have been called a smile. "He would have been both," he said, "at exactly the same time." That was very much your father." The wind moved between them and then settled. Fern looked out across the white fields that ran to the tree line. The land out here had a particular winter quality that she had grown up with and then spent years in the city half forgetting. The way it went on without any apology for being itself. The way the cold was not hostile but simply present, indifferent the way true things are indifferent, waiting for you to either understand it or not. "I'm going back to finish my degree in the spring," she said. "Good, environmental science. With a focus on agricultural contamination." She paused. "I think I might want to do what my father did, what you did, the right version of it." Ridley looked at her. There was something in his expression that she had not seen there before, or perhaps had seen without knowing what it was. A kind of opening up in the weathered set of his face, like ground that has been frozen for a long time beginning, very slowly, to give. "The right version of it is the only version worth doing," he said. "Everything else is just paperwork." She drove back to the highway with the heater going full, and the radio playing something from a station in Dauphin, and the flat white land unrolled on either side of her, like a sentence that had finally, after a very long time, found its ending. Her father had kept that badge of honest work pressed against his chest for 22 years. She intended to earn her own.